Gresham College presents The Psychology of Politics by Professor Glenn D. Wilson.
That's my name underneath there, but it's not a portrait of me. You might actually recognize that gentleman addressing that small rally of followers there. Actually, that's a topic that I might have covered, mass hysteria and the way that it can be manipulated by charismatic people. I will be talking more about the way in which personality connects with political attitudes and, in turn, questions like the rise of dictators. A classic pioneering piece of research is that of Theodor Adorno and his colleagues, Elsie, Frenkel, Brunswick, and others, published initially in 1950 a groundbreaking book called The Authoritarian Personality. Now, these people were refugees from Nazi Germany, and they were interested to identify the kind of personality who would be susceptible to becoming a fascist. This was their particular interest. And they came up with a number of characteristics that typified an authoritarian person, including tendencies towards militarism, strict sexual morality, ethnocentrism, rigid conventionality, and blind obedience to higher authority, combined with a vindictive attitude towards weaker individuals. Now, the theory underlying this had a psychoanalytic bent. Their interpretation was that being a victim of rather harsh upbringing, the authoritarian person is building resentment towards the parents, but of course, being very conforming, they don't feel free to express that resentment towards their parents, and so they displace it in the form of hostility towards ethnic outgroups and weaker individuals. Now, that specific hypothesis has had very little empirical support, I have to say, but the idea of emotions powering political attitudes has been very influential. Yeah, now, Adorno and colleagues had assumed that authoritarianism was an exclusively right-wing phenomenon. But this man, Hans Eysenck, also a refugee from Nazism, reckoned that there was an equivalent authoritarianism of the left. And in 1954, he published a factor analysis to reveal two independent dimensions of political attitudes that he called radicalism, left to right there, and tough, tender-minded. And he said that these two were independent of each other. So you could be an authoritarian either of the left or of the right. Subsequent studies have shown that indeed these two extreme positions are related to aggressive, hostile, dogmatic personality styles. But of course the communists and the fascists were furious at Eysenck's suggestion that they had anything whatsoever in common. And as if to prove the point, Eysenck was personally offered physical violence from representatives of both the fascists and the communists at different times in his career. Now, my own research back in the late 60s and 70s was focusing on a dimension that you might think of as small c conservatism, characterized by resistance to change and a dislike of complexity. I'd identified a general factor underlying attitudes in virtually all fields that seem to reflect a fundamental personality trait. Why should attitudes towards the death penalty predict attitudes towards evolution theory, towards fluoridation, towards jazz, towards premarital sex, for example? On the face of it, they seem like totally unrelated issues. And yet, there was a connection between them all, a general factor running through them, which I decided was best called small c conservatism, And it seemed to reflect something that I described as fear of uncertainty. And I hypothesized that it was to some degree an inborn constitutional trait. The particular conservatism scale that I devised became widely used in many studies since that time, and it adopted a catchphrase item format. Rather than a lengthy, detailed statement of opinion that you had to agree or disagree with, which seemed to me to introduce a lot of ambiguity, where you might agree with one part of the statement and not another, for example, I reduced it just to the emotional core, the center of the issue, using catchphrases like death penalty, abortion, fluoridation, to bring it close to the emotional core of the issue. And my idea was that if you got enough randomly chosen controversial issues, the topicality of them would vary over time, but they would each tap some element of general conservatism, so that the specific variance would cancel out and a summed score would give you a good overall measure, rather in the same way that an IQ score reflects the central factor running through all kinds of very specific abilities. The one restriction that I imposed was that any of these conservatism scales should contain an equal number of items that were scored in the conservative direction and in the liberal direction in order to cancel out what we had recognized was an acquiescence response bias. Tendency for some people to prefer to say yes and others to prefer to say no. More people are yay-sayers, apparently, than naysayers, but that was a trait that we wanted to cancel out by including an equal number of positive and negative items. Now, evidence that conservatism derives from fear of uncertainty has been building over the years. This is a summary of research by an American called Jost. 2006 he published this lot, and you will see that among the variables that predict conservatism are fear of death, fear of threat and loss, intolerance of ambiguity, dislike for complexity, needs for order, structure, and closure, and low openness to experience are all, not necessarily all in that particular list, but they are all traits that have been shown to relate to general conservatism. You can see that the samples are large and many countries have been represented in that research. The effect sizes, don't worry about the fact that some of them are negative, it just depends on the wording of the trait. For example, openness to experience, if you called it closed-mindedness, would have a positive effect size. So don't worry about the signs too much in that particular table. Further support for the idea that conservative attitudes derive from fearful emotions came from a number of studies that I did back in those days, showing that conservatives prefer music that is familiar and predictable, as opposed to stuff they've never heard before and which is a little bit too exciting for them. They tend to dislike complex and abstract forms of art. They certainly would not like the Turner Prize exhibits, I don't think. Liberals also prefer sexual and aggressive cartoons, which is what is being illustrated here. Sexual sick is actually a category in which it features executions and things like that. Very hostile form of humor there. And liberals prefer those two categories particularly. The only one the conservatives decisively preferred was puns, a very safe, non-tendentious kind of humor. And there was a slight tendency for the conservatives to go for incongruity jokes. We later split that into jokes in which the incongruity was resolved in the course of the joke, and found that conservatives were particularly keen on that, a kind of joke which starts off with a lot of uncertainty and ends with a nice, cozy solution at the end of it. Again, support for the idea of fear underlying conservative attitudes comes from physiological studies to signals of threat. This is a study by Oxley and colleagues in 2008 in which they measured startle reflexes indexed by the magnitude of the eye blink to a sudden, unexpected loud noise. That's what this diagram is showing. And people who were conservative on issues like Bible truth, death penalty, patriotism, gun control, of course that's a reversed item, opposed to gun control, and opposed to pornography and premarital sex, were more likely to show a high eye blink response to a sudden noise, suggesting that they were threat-prone individuals. They also followed up with studies of skin conductance in response to threatening visual images, things like spiders and open wounds, and again found that those of a conservative disposition were more reactive in terms of their skin conductance. Skin conductance, of course, is one of the components of the lie detector, measures general emotional arousal. Oxley et al. Described the attitudes that they were talking about as protection of the social order, but they were nevertheless items that could have been taken directly from my conservatism scale, so I think the dimension means very much the same thing. Their interpretation of it is that political attitudes and responses to threat both derive from neural activity patterns, and very likely those surrounding the amygdala, which is a fear center in the midbrain. Now, here's an interesting one. Political conservatism seems to relate to disgust sensitivity, indexed by squeamishness towards things like insects, insanitary conditions, foul odors, and so on. That has been established as a direct correlation initially, but there's an interesting experimental study or two in which they found that if they were interviewing people about their political attitudes, and in some cases they were standing underneath a notice which raised consciousness of hygiene issues, this poster in the background, even though it was never pointed out by the experimenters, would shift their expressed attitudes in a conservative direction. And a number of studies have indicated that this sensitivity towards disgusting stimuli of one sort or another is characteristic of people with these small c conservative attitudes. I keep saying small c because I don't mean they're necessarily followers of the conservative David Cameron's party. But it seems like the fearfulness of conservatives goes beyond just uncertainty to concern about what they might catch off other people, because that contagious diseases was a particular area of threat concern to them. Differences between people describing themselves as liberal and conservative show up as differences in brain patterns, that is, electrical signals being emitted from the brain in response to particular events in the environment. They're called event-related potentials. In a particular area called the anterior cingulate gyrus. In this particular study, Amodio and colleagues found that there were two particular components to the ERP. They're using what is called a go-no-go paradigm, in which you've got two buttons. One of them you have to hit if a particular stimulus appears on a screen, and the other one you have to resist hitting it. One's a go and one's a no-go. So there's a degree of conflict being built into this. And what they found was that there were certain parts of the ERP, the event-related potentials, which indicated that liberals have greater sensitivity for cues to altering a habitual response pattern that is no longer useful. Faced with that conflict, to press or not to press a button, according to what's going on around them, the liberals were more flexible in altering their behavioral patterns. You can also observe it in brain structure, structural MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. This is a study by Kanai and company, in which they found that people calling themselves liberals had more grey matter in the area of the cingulate gyrus here. And that's an area that is associated with the same area that Amodio and company were studying. It's associated with self-regulatory conflict monitoring. So people at the liberal end of the political spectrum, self-rated, I have to say, and nothing to do with voting, had larger areas of grey matter in that particular area. But then the conservatives had a larger brain area in the amygdala, down here, the midbrain area that is associated with fear processing in the brain. Again, supporting the idea of conservatism reflecting a fear of uncertainty. Now, the idea that social and political attitudes could be genetically transmitted, which is the idea I put up in the 70s, flies in the face of the common wisdom that attitudes are learned in the family. It was almost religious text in social psychology at the time that attitudes were learned. They were a social phenomenon. You've got to be carefully taught. But there is, in fact, now insurmountable evidence that genetics contribute quite powerfully to attitude variations. And this, of course, is seen most obviously in the fact that identical twins are more alike in their attitudes than non-identical twins. And after you correct for assortative mating, that is, a tendency for the parents to be similar in their attitudes in the first place, you can calculate that heritability for conservatism as a general attitude factor comes out at around 0.5, rather similar to other personality traits. It's also interesting that the more heritable the attitude, the more it is close to a kind of a gut reaction, in the sense that it people react to it, make their decision more speedily. They're also more resistant to change if the heritability of the attitude is high. That's what the study of Tessa established. The other interesting thing that comes out of these studies is that the heritability factor is very much stronger than the shared family effect. That is the socialization effect. That if you are learning your attitudes within the family, then there are processes that would make you more like your siblings than you would otherwise be expected to be. Now, it seems that insofar as 50% of your attitudes is determined by the environment, it is not the shared family environment that is most influential. It is various accidental encounters with differing peer groups, maybe your birth order, which is a sense in which you are different from your siblings rather than similar, but it is the non-shared environment that comes out as more important. Don't worry too much about the detail of this, but I thought I would show you how these calculations made. The heritability estimate is taken as the difference between the correlation between monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins doubled. That gives you an estimate of heritability. The estimate for the shared environment is twice the DZ correlation minus the MZ correlation over there, looking at that first one. Now, the reason for that, of course, is that the shared environment you might expect to raise the correlation for dizygotic twins, but would have little effect on the correlation for monozygotic twins. That's the logic behind that. The unshared environment is actually the difference between the monozygotic correlation and 100%. So you subtract that from 100, come out with the unshared component. On that particular issue, incidentally, school prayer, you notice that there is a reasonable shared family environment effect. It's still lower than the unshared effect and lower than heritability, but it is there. So depending on the particular issue that you are looking at, there are variations in how heritable they are and the relative partitioning between shared and unshared environment. And incidentally, voting, party affiliation and voting choices are rather more influenced by the shared environment than general attitudes, which have much more of an emotional basis to them. Right, so to a large extent, of course, we're in a multi-genetic situation, as you would be with intelligence or personality, but that hasn't stopped people from identifying particular gene loci that seem to be particularly influential or involved. The one that has come up most interestingly is the 7R variant of the dopamine receptor gene DRD4, which has previously been associated with novelty-seeking. And in this particular study, the researchers found that if you did have that 7R variant in this panel, then there was a correlation with the number of friends and liberalism. That is, people with lots of friends tended to be more liberal, but only if they had 2 R7 copies of that particular variant of the DRD4. If they didn't, without those 7R variants, then there was no correlation between the number of friends and liberalism. Which is interesting because it shows a particular gene that is involved both with novelty-seeking and conservatism, as though the two are, of course, bipolar opposites of each other, and logically that follows. But there is also an interaction with your social experiences, in this case, which led the authors to suppose that this genetic predisposition would make a person more liberal only when it's embedded in a social context that provides them with multiple points of view, which would be the situation of having a lot of friends. So it's the friends that perhaps give them more flexibility in their choices and tilt them towards liberalism. So it's a gene-environment interaction. Correlations between personality and ideology are also consistent with the uncertainty hypothesis. This is using the Big Five personality classification. Don't know if you're familiar with that, but they are 5 major dimensions of personality that have been established by research over the years. And 2 of them have been found to predict liberalism and conservatism. Openness to experience, that one predicts liberalism, whereas conscientiousness predicts conservatism. Those are the 2 most striking ones. These researchers also found that childhood trauma, that is, self-recalled verbal, physical, and sexual abuse, contributed, though to a much lesser degree than personality, to the likelihood of a liberal attitude pattern. That's there, for example, childhood trauma. It's not quite clear why that should be so. It might be that being open to experience increases the likelihood of being abused, or it could be the experience of being abused that raises empathy for those who are disadvantaged. So having had a bad time yourself, you can feel more sympathetic to others who are also having a tough time. But one thing to note about it is that it is directly counter to the Adorno et al. Hypothesis that a rough childhood makes you more authoritarian and more dismissive of less fortunate people. It does not seem to be the case. So, as Harry Hill might say, which is better? We don't have to fight over this particularly because there is no striking difference in intelligence between liberals and conservatives from all of the research. Some people have reported that liberals have slightly higher cognitive ability and flexibility, but the difference is extremely small. And there isn't much difference between liberals and conservatives in terms of general neuroticism, despite the susceptibility of conservatives to threat and to disgust. General neuroticism, they don't differ very much. Ambrose Pierce, who wrote the Devil's Dictionary, I think it was called, said that conservatives are enamored of existing evils, while liberals want to replace them with others. So a rather nice definition of the difference. Hirsch and colleagues maintain that liberals and conservatives are both driven by values, but they have values in a slightly different order of priority. For liberals, it's openness, compassion, and equality that are uppermost. Conservatives are more concerned about order, tradition, and reliability. And these are values that are deeply embedded in a person's biology and their genetic heritage. The fact that both orientations continue to exist in a very persistent kind of a way would suggest that they have evolutionary costs and benefits, and therefore both probably contribute to an effective balance in society. There is a place for both liberals and conservatives. So on to the connection between small c conservatism that we've been talking about to this point and voting preferences. Well, a fear of uncertainty might lead some people to preserve or seek to preserve what is established and to prefer continuity rather than change. And insofar as a party states this as an aim, it should attract people with conservative personalities. And indeed, at least within the Italian context, this has been shown to be the case, that voting choices are influenced by a factor called need for closure, which is a personality trait remarkably like conservatism. Those with greater need for closure tending to vote for right-wing parties. And that could explain perhaps why disadvantaged people sometimes embrace right-wing political parties that might seem counter to their interests. You might dub that the Alf Garnett effect. These parties would offer continuity, predictability, and hence control anxiety. Advantaged people are perhaps more likely to gravitate towards right-wing politics for reasons of self-interest or social dominance. Age is also a factor because as people get older, they become less exploratory, less novelty-seeking, and of course they are likely to have acquired more to conserve. So that would suggest a tilt towards right-wing voting preferences. For many voters, the central issue is that of wealth distribution. David Frost once remarked that a conservative is somebody who demands a square deal for the rich, whereas G.B. Shaw noted that a government that robs Peter to pay Paul can always count on support from Paul. So, you know, those who have wealth believe that they've earned it or otherwise deserve it, and therefore that they prefer that it is not redistributed. Whereas those who have little deplore the greed of the rich and feel that it ought to be shared more equally. That's a class-tied issue, and against that many other controversies may pale into insignificance, particularly in times of economic difficulty, perhaps. So it is not surprising that personality maps only very loosely onto political allegiances. When it comes to understanding the emergence of dictators, the liberal conservative dimension is probably not uppermost. We need to return to Eysenck's tough-mindedness dimension, a dimension in politics that is independent of left versus right, and which distinguishes both fascists and communists from more tender-minded people at the other end. It's a trait that's characterized by aggression and intolerance, and seems to account for the appeal of extreme parties of whatever leaning. The dictator usually has some degree of charisma that enables them to marshal support from individuals and populations that are harboring some kind of anger or resentment. So it would follow that a dictator is not solely responsible for his policies. Some blame must attach to those who support their ascendancy. Dictators' personality can only be assessed at a distance, what is called remote assessment. But there's nevertheless a great deal of agreement amongst the experts as to the personality traits that characterize them. Coolidge and Siegel in 2009 did a study comparing the characteristics of Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, and Kim Jong-il, and concluded that all three displayed antisocial, narcissistic, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders, along with sadism and paranoia. Fallon, more recently, concurs, noting that dictators share many traits with clinical psychopaths. They're usually charming, charismatic, intelligent, brimming with self-confidence and independence, self-absorbed, and masterful liars, brimming with self-confidence, oh, I said that, compassionless, often to the degree of being sadistic, and with a boundless appetite for sex and power. Hence, concept of bunga-bunga. Don't know whether you'd regard Berlusconi as a dictator. He wasn't quite, but it's a word that was applied to him particularly. But dictators are very fond of that idea. Paranoia, they have a fear of plots, but then some of them are probably real. The key principle of dictators, of course, was that advised by Machiavelli in his book The Prince, 1532. He wrote that it is safer to be feared than loved. I think that's the key principle that they operate by. Now, it's said that power corrupts, and there's considerable evidence that that is the case. The famous Stanford prison experiment of 1971, Philip Zimbardo and his colleagues randomly assigned students to the roles of prisoners and guards in a makeshift prison in the basement of Stanford University. And so quickly did the guards become abusive and cruel to their prisoners, and the prisoners became so passive that they decided to terminate the experiment within 6 days. They'd intended it to last for months, but they wrapped it up very quickly because it was getting a bit nasty. There's a whole series of experiments by other psychologists, social psychologists, many of them around the Stanford University area, concerned with what happens if you give people a sense of power. There are various ways of inducing that experimentally, and they would seem like fairly mild manipulations. For example, asking them to recall an incident in which they had experienced a feeling of power. Others would be asked to recall a situation of low power in which they felt rather impotent. Those primed to feel more powerful turned out to be less empathic, as indicated by tests like ability to recognize emotion in the face of other people. They're also less compassionate, as measured by the ability to control their own emotions when confronted by images of people who are suffering. There's also an indication that they would become more self-oriented here. If you were asked to draw an E on your forehead, there are two ways you could do it. You can draw the E so that it could be read from the outside, or you could draw the E so that it looks the right way around from your internal point of view. Now, the interesting thing that these studies showed was that if you give people a sense of power, or for whatever reason they feel powerful, they are inclined to write the E so it looks right to themselves. They become egocentric, whereas less powerful people are more likely to see the point of view of people from the outside. And that was the conclusion of the authors, that power makes people arrogant and reduces their capacity to comprehend how other people see, think, and feel. That's the empathic aspect of it. Other researchers have found that empowered people are more likely to believe that they have control even of random activities, such as the outcome of a dice throw. And the evidence for that is if they're given the choice of, they're asked to predict which way the dice are going to fall, and they're given the choice of letting somebody else throw the dice, or they could throw the dice themselves, they will tend to choose to throw the dice themselves because they have a kind of an illusory sense of control. And you can see that that might have benefits to a leader in terms of self-confidence, believing that they control the world, but it can also lead to poor choices, and indeed it may be one of the ways in which power often leads to its own demise. There are studies which show that giving people a sense of power will tend to result in a dehumanizing tendency. That is, subjects who naturally report a feeling of power tend to be more derogatory about other people. In this particular study, they were asked about the inhabitants of a fictional South American country called Aurelia. And, of course, powerful people tended to review them as less civilized and more infantile in their behavior. They don't exist, but that's the way these foreigners were perceived. Some of the subjects were then primed to feel more powerful than they were previously. And that made them more likely to back a plan to clear people from slums, even against their will. And another one of their studies, they assigned people the roles of a senior surgeon, a junior surgeon, or a nurse. These are ranks within the NHS or any hospital system. These are Americans. No, actually, they're Dutch, I think, these researchers. But those who were ranked higher within the medical system were more likely to choose treatments for the patients that were painful but effective. Now that's interesting because it shows a lack of empathy in a sense, but on the other hand, they may be making a tough but necessary decision. So dehumanization is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people require a degree of dehumanization, and medical people, perhaps surgeons particularly, might benefit from that. Possibly some political leaders have to make tough decisions. I don't know whether our current coalition is in the position of having to make tough, to give out a harsh treatment, which might hopefully be more effective. Now, an American called Keltner has come up with what he calls the paradox of power. He says that people feel less inclination to make alliances with others when they are elevated to great power. And he notes that the qualities that facilitate the rise to power, things like social intelligence, skill in negotiation, cooperation, responsibility, these are the very traits that decline once power has been achieved. So once in positions of power, people begin to act selfishly, impulsively, and aggressively. Traits which are psychopathic. So if a dictator isn't necessarily psychopathic to begin with, they are likely to become so progressively over time. I think you recognize this particular gentleman, do you? It's Idi Amin, the Ugandan dictator. Thought that's far enough removed in time for him not to come after me. Well, that's this paradox of power of Keltner's, I think, is a warning that we need to heed. What defense do we have against it? Well, probably the best defense against the rise of dictators is to have a democratic constitution, such as we have, in which leaders have fixed terms, which will prevent them from becoming so entrenched that Keltner's paradox has time to operate. In the American presidency, you can have for only 2 terms. We do allow more terms in Britain at the moment. I think Tony Blair was re-elected twice. Margaret Thatcher was. Whether anybody can detect any tendency towards arrogance creeping in as these individuals wore on in their reign, I don't know. Far be it from me to make any suggestions of that kind. I think I'd like to open it up to questions, if you like. Thank you very much.
For more information, please go to www.gresham.ac.uk.